Tell me I'm reading this wrong.
Say it isn't true, Mom. Just say it.
Sophie, wait, you knew.
Both of you. You've known for weeks.
I was trying to protect you.
From what? From the truth?
From something you didn't need to carry.
It wasn't yours to decide what I carry. Either of you.
3 weeks earlier, none of these three people could have imagined standing in that hallway. Sophie Calloway had a wedding to plan. Malik Reeves had a life to build. And Vivian Calloway had a secret she swore she would take to her grave. I want you to hold on to that image for a moment. A mother, a daughter, and the man caught between them, standing in a hallway where nobody is willing to speak first. Because by the end of this story, you're going to understand exactly what brought them there. And you're going to have to decide for yourself who deserved forgiveness and who didn't. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching this from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand how it ended in that hallway, you first need to understand how it started, over a shared blueberry muffin on an ordinary morning when none of this seemed possible. This story has three people at its center. Sophie Calloway, 26 years old, the only daughter of one of the most feared women in American finance. Vivian Calloway, a self-made billionaire who clawed her way from a trailer park in Ohio to the top of Wall Street, and who trusted almost no one. And Malik Reeves, the outsider who was never supposed to matter. Here, what we still don't fully know. Did Vivian fall for Malik out of genuine love, or was it something colder, something about control? Did Sophie ever suspect what was happening under her own roof? And when Malik finally made his move, the one that shattered this family in a single night, was he protecting the woman he loved or destroying her? Stay with me, because what's coming is not what you think. To understand how this all happened, you have to understand who Vivian Calloway was before any of this began. Vivian grew up with nothing. Her father left when she was 6. Her mother worked 2 jobs and still couldn't keep the lights on some months. By 17, Vivian had already decided that she would never again feel that particular kind of powerlessness, the kind that comes from depending on someone else. She put herself through business school on loans and scholarships, worked nights at a diner, and by 24 she'd landed her first job at a mid-tier investment firm in New York. Colleagues from that era describe her the same way, again and again. Brilliant, relentless, and impossible to read. By 35, Vivian had built her own firm, Calloway Capital, from a 2-room office into a name whispered with respect and fear across Wall Street. She married once briefly to a man named Richard Calloway, an architect. Sophie was born a year later. The marriage didn't survive Sophie's 5th birthday. Friends of the family say Vivian gave Sophie everything money could buy and almost nothing that money couldn't. Private schools, a horse, a driver. What Sophie didn't get, according to people close to the family, was time. Vivian was in board meetings during recitals. She was closing acquisitions during summer breaks. Sophie grew up polite, poised, and quietly starved for her mother's attention. That's the woman Sophie became, kind, a little guarded, always trying to prove she'd earned things on her own rather than because of her mother's name. At 24, Sophie moved out of the family penthouse and into a small apartment in Brooklyn, working an entry-level job at a nonprofit, telling almost no one who her mother was. That's where Malik Reeves comes in. Malik was 29, born and raised in Queens, the son of a nurse and a transit worker. He'd played football in high school, blown out his knee senior year, and rebuilt himself, literally, through physical therapy and strength training. That experience became a career. By the time he met Sophie, Malik had built a small but loyal client base as a personal trainer, and he was saving every spare dollar toward opening his own studio. Malik and Sophie met the way a lot of ordinary love stories start, at a coffee shop near her apartment, both reaching for the same last blueberry muffin.
You have to try
She
this.
laughed. He offered to split it. Neither of them mentioned money, family, or last names for the first 2 months. Malik would later tell a close friend that Sophie just felt real, like someone who actually wanted to know him, not what he could do for her. It wasn't until their third date, when Sophie casually mentioned her mother was flying in from Zurich and wanted to meet him, that Malik discovered the woman he was falling for was the daughter of Vivian Calloway, a name he recognized from the cover of a business magazine sitting in his own gym's waiting room. He almost didn't go to that dinner. He told friends he felt out of his depth, like he was about to be judged and found wanting before he even sat down, but Sophie asked him to trust her, so he did. That dinner, at a private dining room in Manhattan, was the first time Malik Reeves and Vivian Calloway were ever in the same room together. Neither of them could have predicted what it would set in motion. People who were there that night, a waiter, a family friend seated nearby, say Vivian was unusually quiet for most of the meal. She watched Malik more than she spoke to him. At one point, she asked him a single question that seemed to catch him off guard, wanting to know not what he could offer her daughter, but what he actually wanted for himself. He answered honestly. He wanted to build something of his own. He wanted to matter to people because of who he was, not what he had. Vivian didn't say much after that, but something in her expression shifted, and Sophie noticed it too, though she couldn't yet name what it was. Over the following months, Malik became a regular presence in Sophie's life, and almost by accident in Vivian's. It started small. Vivian, recovering from a minor knee surgery, needed a physical therapist and personal trainer to help her regain mobility. Sophie, without thinking much of it, suggested Malik. He was good at his job. He was trustworthy. Why not? 3 sessions a week, in the private gym of Vivian's Manhattan penthouse, Malik guided one of the most powerful women in finance through stretches and light resistance training. And slowly, something neither of them expected began to take shape. Vivian Calloway was used to people who wanted something from her, business partners who flattered her for access, suitors over the years who seemed more interested in her net worth than her company. Malik was different. In the gym, he didn't know her as a billionaire. He knew her as a 53-year-old woman working through pain, frustration, and the particular vulnerability of a body that no longer did everything it used to. She would later admit to one confidant that he talked to her like a person, not like an asset, not like a target, just a person having a hard week. Over weeks, their sessions began running long. Vivian, notoriously impatient with everyone from her own board of directors to visiting heads of state, would linger afterward to talk about books, about her childhood, about a version of herself she rarely let anyone see. Malik, for his part, found himself looking forward to those conversations more than he was comfortable admitting. He told himself it was harmless. She was his girlfriend's mother. She was paying his rate generously and referring him to 2 of her friends. There was nothing wrong with a professional relationship that happened to be pleasant. But according to a close friend Malik eventually confided in, there was a night in early spring that changed everything. Vivian had just returned from a brutal week of board meetings, a hostile takeover attempt against her own company that she'd barely fought off. She was, for the first time Malik had seen, visibly shaken. He found her sitting alone on the terrace of the penthouse instead of in the gym, staring out at the skyline, a glass of untouched wine beside her. He almost turned around and left. Instead, he sat down beside her, not as her trainer, but as a person who noticed someone hurting. He told her gently that she didn't have to be the strongest person in every room, not with him. Whatever Vivian said back that night, she never repeated it to anyone. But according to a member of her household staff, she came inside 20 minutes later, and for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, she looked like she'd been crying. From that point forward, something had shifted, though nothing had technically happened. Vivian began finding reasons to text Malik outside of scheduled sessions, a question about a stretch, a recommendation for a book, later simply asking how his day had gone. Malik answered everyone. He told himself it was just kindness. Meanwhile, Sophie's relationship with Malik was deepening in its own right. He met her closest friends. He'd spent a weekend with her at a lake house upstate. There was even, according to Sophie's roommate at the time, a ring that Malik had quietly begun researching, nothing extravagant, just something honest, something that matched who he actually was. He was, by every account, planning a future with Sophie, which is what makes what happened next so difficult for everyone involved to explain. It was a Thursday evening in late April. Sophie was traveling for work. Malik arrived at the penthouse for what was supposed to be a routine session with Vivian. Instead, he found her in the living room, dressed not for exercise but for dinner, a private dinner set for two that Malik had not been told about in advance. Vivian told him plainly that she had canceled the session. She wanted, instead, to talk. And over the next 2 hours, in a conversation that Malik would later describe as the most uncomfortable of his life, Vivian Calloway told him the truth she had clearly been carrying for weeks.
I love you.
She told him she knew exactly how it sounded, but she needed him to know that this wasn't about hurting Sophie. It was about something she hadn't felt in 20 years, and she didn't know what to do with it. Malik sat frozen. According to what he later told a close friend, his first instinct wasn't anger, it was disbelief, followed almost immediately by a cold, sinking fear about what this could mean for Sophie, for the relationship he'd built, for the family he'd started to feel a part of. He told her, as gently and as firmly as he could, that nothing could ever happen between them, that he loved Sophie, and that what Vivian was describing wasn't something he could return. Vivian, by his account, nodded, apologized, and asked for one thing, that he never tell Sophie. Not because she was ashamed, she said, though friends believe she was, but because she was afraid of what it would do to a daughter who had already spent a lifetime feeling like she came second. Malik agreed. He walked out of that penthouse that night believing he could simply bury the conversation and move forward as if it had never happened. He was wrong. For nearly 6 weeks, Malik kept his promise. He stopped training Vivian, citing a scheduling conflict. He threw himself further into his relationship with Sophie, proposing, quietly, without an audience on a rooftop in Brooklyn on a Sunday evening in early June. Sophie said yes. For a moment, it looked as though Malik had successfully closed the door on the strangest, most unsettling night of his life. According to 2 people close to the family, Vivian's reaction to the engagement news was not what anyone expected. She didn't storm out. She didn't object publicly. Instead, she insisted on hosting the engagement dinner herself at the family estate in the Hamptons, to do it properly, as she put it. Malik was uneasy about the invitation. He told a friend he felt like he was walking into something he couldn't quite name, but refusing would have raised questions he wasn't ready to answer, so he went. The dinner on the surface was elegant and warm. Vivian gave a toast that brought several guests to tears, praising Sophie's independence and, pointedly, Malik's honesty, a word she repeated twice, according to a guest who later spoke about the evening. But behind the toasts and the candlelight, something had already begun to unravel. Sophie's college roommate, seated near Vivian that night, later described an odd moment. Vivian's eyes lingering on Malik a beat too long during the toast, her hand trembling slightly as she raised her glass. It was a small thing, the kind of detail that means nothing until it means everything. 2 weeks after the engagement dinner, Sophie was going through old family emails, searching for a document related to wedding venue logistics that her mother's assistant had promised to send. Instead, she stumbled onto something she was never meant to see, a folder of drafted, unsent messages from her mother's private account, dated from the same week as that Thursday night dinner in April. None of the messages had ever been sent, but they didn't need to be sent to
Tell me
devastate
I'm
her.
reading this wrong.
Sophie read lines that described feelings her mother had never spoken aloud to anyone, feelings directed, unmistakably, at Malik. She sat with that laptop for nearly 3 hours before she told a single person. The first person Sophie called wasn't Malik. It was her childhood best friend, Renee, who later described the phone call as the most controlled panic she'd ever heard in someone's voice. Sophie wasn't screaming. She wasn't crying, at least not yet. She was, in Renee's words, trying to figure out how much of her life had been a lie. Sophie didn't confront her mother that night. Instead, in a decision she would later describe as the hardest of her adult life, she decided to test something first. She wanted to know if Malik already knew. She invited him to dinner the following evening, an ordinary Tuesday, nothing about the invitation different from 100 others before it. But partway through the meal, without warning, she asked him directly whether anything had ever happened between him and her mother, and not physically, she clarified. She wanted to know if Vivian had ever told him how she felt. Malik has since said that in that moment, he felt the floor drop out beneath him. He'd spent 6 weeks convincing himself the conversation in April could simply be forgotten, filed away, never spoken of again. He hadn't accounted for the possibility that the truth would find its way to Sophie regardless of what he did or didn't say. He chose honesty. Haltingly, painfully, he told Sophie everything: the dinner, Vivian's confession, his refusal, his promise to keep it quiet in order to protect her. According to Renee, who spoke with Sophie immediately afterward, Sophie's first reaction wasn't anger at Malik. It was something closer to grief for the version of her mother she thought she knew, and grief for the 6 weeks Malik had spent carrying a secret that belonged, she felt, to both of them. She told him she wasn't angry that he hadn't wanted her mother. She was angry that he'd decided on his own what she could and couldn't handle knowing. It was the beginning of the hardest 3 days of both their lives, the same 3 days you saw at the very start of this video. Sophie needed time before deciding what to do next. She didn't return her mother's calls. She didn't go to work. Malik, for his part, was left in an agonizing limbo, engaged to a woman who wouldn't speak to him, and bound by a promise to a woman he now deeply distrusted. Then Vivian made her first move. On the second day of Sophie's silence, Vivian showed up unannounced at Malik's apartment in Queens, a place, by every account, she had never once visited before. According to a neighbor who witnessed part of the encounter from the hallway, Vivian was there for nearly 45 minutes. What was said behind that closed door has been described differently by different people close to the family, but the version Malik gave to his closest friend afterward was this: Vivian wasn't there to apologize. She was there to negotiate. She offered him a way out, tell Sophie it was a misunderstanding, tell her Vivian had simply been grieving, confused, whatever he wanted to call it, and in exchange, Vivian would make sure he never had to worry about money again. Not for the studio, not for the wedding, not for anything. All she was asking, she told him, was that he protect the family. It was, in effect, an offer. And it was the moment Malik has since described as the true turning point of the entire story. Not the dinner in April, but this one in his own apartment, when the woman who claimed to love him revealed in his eyes exactly how far she was willing to go to control the outcome. He refused the offer, flatly, immediately, without hesitation, according to the friend he called minutes after Vivian left. But refusing wasn't the same as deciding what to do next. Vivian's visit had shown him something he hadn't fully understood before. This wasn't going to end quietly, no matter what he did. So Malik made a decision that would define the rest of this story. He decided that Sophie deserved more than his silence and more than her mother's version of events. He decided to go to Sophie, not to defend himself, but to lay out, in full, exactly what Vivian had just offered him. On the morning of the third day, Malik went to Sophie's apartment in Brooklyn. He didn't call ahead. He wasn't sure she'd let him in if he did. She opened the door. According to Renee, who was there that morning for support, Sophie looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that comes not from lack of sleep, but from 3 days of turning her entire understanding of her family inside out. Malik told her everything about Vivian's visit, the offer, the money, the request to call it all a misunderstanding. He told her the words her mother had used. He told her, too, something he hadn't said out loud before, that he was no longer sure he could trust anything Vivian told either of them going forward. Sophie listened without interrupting, and then she told Malik something that reframed everything he thought he understood about this family. She told him this wasn't the first time. When she was 19, there had been a man, her mother's business partner. She'd found out years later that Vivian had done something similar, convinced him to distance himself from someone, dangled money in front of him to make a problem disappear. Sophie had always assumed it was just business. She admitted quietly that she'd never let herself consider it might be something more. She stopped herself before finishing the thought out loud, but the implication was clear. This wasn't, perhaps, a woman who had simply fallen in love and lost her footing. This was, potentially, a pattern, a woman accustomed to using money and influence to manage the people around her, romantically or otherwise, whenever they threatened the order she'd built. This is where the story diverges, depending on who you ask. People who knew Vivian for decades, former colleagues, a handful of close friends, insist that whatever happened with Malik was genuine if badly handled. One former colleague put it simply: Vivian doesn't let herself feel things easily. When she finally did, she had no idea how to do it without trying to control the outcome. That, this colleague said, is just who she is. Others, including some who worked closely with her at Calloway Capital, describe a woman who had spent 30 years treating relationships, romantic, professional, even parental, as negotiations to be won. To them, the offer to Malik wasn't a desperate, emotional misstep. It was simply Vivian doing what she always did when a situation threatened to spiral outside her control. She tried to buy her way back to order. Sophie needed to know which version was true. So that afternoon, she did something neither Malik nor Vivian saw coming. She called her mother and asked her to come to Brooklyn, not to fight, she said, but to talk once honestly with Malik in the room. Vivian agreed. According to Renee, who left before Vivian arrived but spoke to Sophie immediately after, the meeting that followed lasted nearly 2 hours. Vivian, by Sophie's account, didn't deny anything. She confirmed the conversation from April. She confirmed the visit to Malik's apartment. But she pushed back hard against the characterization of it as manipulation. She told them both that she had been trying to protect Sophie the only way she knew how, that she had spent 30 years learning that feelings were liabilities if you didn't manage them, and that she hadn't known how to have this particular feeling without trying to control what happened to it. That wasn't an excuse, she said. It was just the truth. For a moment, according to Sophie, there was something almost like understanding in the room, a recognition that her mother, for all her power, had never learned another way to love people without also trying to own the outcome. And then Vivian said one more thing, a single sentence that Sophie has described as the moment everything truly broke. She told her daughter that if she married Malik, Vivian would always know that she had seen him first, and that some part of her would never fully let that go. This wasn't an apology, it was a warning. Sophie has since told close friends that this sentence, more than anything else, was what convinced her that her mother's feelings, whatever their origin, had curdled into something possessive, something that would never fully disappear, no matter how the wedding, or the marriage, or the years ahead unfolded. It was Malik, sitting quietly through most of the conversation, who spoke next, and what he said would become the defining moment of this entire story. Malik stood up. According to Sophie, he was calmer, she said, than she'd seen him in the entire 3 days since she'd first found those unsent messages. He told Vivian that he understood she had built everything she had by never letting anyone else hold power over her, But love, he said, wasn't supposed to work that way, and he wasn't going to spend the rest of his life being something she had seen first. He told her plainly that he loved her daughter, not because Sophie was hers, but in spite of how hard this family sometimes made it. And then he told them both what he intended to do next. What Malik said next is the detail that turned this from a private family rupture into a story people still talk about years later. He said he would not accept a single dollar from the Calloway family, not for the wedding, not for his studio, not ever. He told Sophie he wanted to move the wedding up and move it far away from anything connected to her mother's world, no Hampton's estate, no borrowed influence, nothing that could ever again be used as leverage over either of them. And then he turned to Vivian and said something that, according to two people who heard about the conversation afterward, left her speechless for the first time in longer than anyone could remember. He told her that he wasn't going to keep her secret anymore, not because he wanted to hurt her, but because keeping it had almost cost him the one relationship in his life that was never about money or power. He told her that Sophie deserved a mother who could love her without needing to control everything around that love, and that he hoped, someday, she could be that. But he wasn't going to help her hide from becoming her. He wasn't trying to destroy the family. He was trying to force it to finally be honest. Vivian left that night without another word. According to household staff, she didn't speak to anyone for nearly 2 full days afterward, an almost unheard-of silence for a woman who ran board meetings and negotiated multi-million-dollar deals without ever missing a beat. Sophie and Malik were married 5 months later, not at the family estate but at a small vineyard upstate with 60 guests instead of the 300 Vivian had originally planned. Vivian attended. She sat in the second row, not the first. She gave no toast. According to Renee, who stood beside Sophie that day, Vivian approached her daughter privately before the ceremony began. She told Sophie she didn't know how to do this without wanting to control it, but that she was going to try, and that it was the only wedding gift she had that actually meant anything. It wasn't a full reconciliation. Family friends described the relationship between Vivian and Sophie in the years since as improving, but never fully repaired. A mother and daughter who speak regularly now, who spend holidays together, but who both privately admit that something about their trust in each other changed permanently that year, and never fully returned to what it once was. As for Vivian herself, those close to her say the experience did soften her, at least somewhat. She stepped back from day-to-day operations at Calloway Capital the following year, citing a desire to focus on what actually matters, words several colleagues describe as the closest thing to vulnerability they ever heard her express publicly. Malik, for his part, opened his own training studio 18 months later, funded entirely through his own savings and a small business loan, no Calloway money, exactly as he'd promised. Today, he and Sophie live in Brooklyn, a few miles from where they first met over a shared blueberry muffin. So was Malik a hero for refusing to be bought, and for refusing to let a lie define his marriage before it even began? Or did his decision to force the truth into the open cause more pain than it prevented, for a mother who was, by every account, simply as lost in her own feelings as anyone else might have been? There isn't a clean answer. Maybe that's the most honest ending this story has. Before you go, I want to ask you something, because I think this story means something different to everyone who hears it. If you were Sophie, would you have forgiven your mother the way she did? Or would 3 days of silence have turned into something that never healed at all? And if you were Malik, would you have taken the deal? Not necessarily the money, but the quiet, the easier path of simply letting it all disappear. I'd genuinely love to know. Drop a comment below and tell me what you would have done in Malik's position. I read every single one, and honestly, some of the most powerful moments in this channel come from your comments, not from the story itself. And if this story pulled you in the way I hope it did, if you found yourself holding your breath during that final conversation on the porch, you're going to want to see what happens in our next story. Because if you thought a mother falling for her daughter's fiancé was shocking, wait until you hear what happened when two sisters discovered they'd both secretly been engaged to the same man, 3 years apart, and neither one knew until the wedding invitations landed in the same mailbox. If you're new here, this channel is all about real, human stories, love, betrayal, family, and the choices that define who we really are when everything is on the line. If that's the kind of story you love getting lost in, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Thank you for spending this hour with me. I'll see you in the next story.